Short crust pastry. I'm going to give you a basic overview of the science of short crust pastry. Hopefully this will make you a better pastry chef. You need to use plain flour. This is because it has a lower gluten content. Short crust pastry is all about keeping the gluten content down. This is the protein in the pastry, which is what we want in bread to make it springy and chewy, but we do not want the gluten in pastry because we want the pastry to be tender. I have 3 different fats here: lard, which is an animal fat, solid margarine, which is vegetable based, and butter, which we all know is made from milk. You could use any of these in isolation. This would give you a very flaky pastry, but a very pale colour pastry and not particularly tasting very nice. This sits somewhere in the middle. Fairly good colour, but you do have the taste of margarine. Butter gives the best taste, but it is not as easy to rub in, and sometimes the taste can be overpowering and it's not quite as short, doesn't produce quite as tender pastry as lard would. So the best compromise is to do 50% lard and stalk or 50% butter and lard. You need half the amount of fat to the amount of flour. So for 200 grams of flour, I need 100 grams of fat. So I will use 50 grams of butter and 50 grams of lard. So here I have my 200 grams of plain flour, 50 grams of lard and 50 grams of butter. I'm just going to cube it. It's important that the butter has come out of the fridge. It needs to be relatively cold. Not too cold, however. I would say leave it out of the fridge for 10 minutes before you make your pastry. Soft margarine will not make a good pastry because the plasticity is not correct. A soft margarine will not produce a flaky pastry. It will produce quite a chewy pastry. So just break that up in there. With nice clean hands, we're using our fingertips. We need to keep this fat cool. If I rubbed my hands together and then touched my face with the palms and then my fingertips, the fingertips are the coolest. There is a saying that a good pastry chef never gets flour on the palms of their hands. We're going to do a rubbing in technique. So if I do it upside down, I've just got my fingertips and I'm rubbing my thumbs over my fingertips. Just break this fat down into the flour. What we are actually doing is putting a waterproof coating over all of the flour particles. This will ensure that when the water is added to the pastry, it will prevent more gluten from developing. So basically, if you had flour and you add water, over time the flour will absorb the water and gluten strands will develop. This is what makes it elasticy. We don't want that. We just want to have short, tender pastry. So by waterproofing the flour molecules, we will create shorter gluten strands and a tender pastry. When you think that you have rubbed your fat in with your fingertips, give the bowl a shake and any large lumps will go to the surface, and then you can continue to rub those in. When your fat is fully rubbed in and it looks like coarse sand, you are now ready to add the water. The general rule of thumb is 5 ml of water for every 25 grams of flour. I make that 40 ml of water for 200 gram of flour. The water needs to be really, really cold. This is so that it doesn't melt the fat. You need to keep the fat solid. Starting off with a round knife or a palette knife, combine the pastry. You do not want to overhandle the pastry because we do not want heat going into it from your hands. So that is my 40 ml. You do not add water until it naturally comes together. You need to get your hand in here. I did put a pinch of salt in mine as well. If it is really dry, then you can add just a splash more cold water. So I'm just going to add about 5 ml. Then just bring it together with your hand quickly, work quickly. I'm not putting pressure on the palm of my hand. The water plays 2 important roles in the pastry. One of these roles is that when the pastry is cooking in the oven, the water will evaporate, producing steam, and will make your pastry rise ever so slightly to make it lighter, flakier and more tender. Role number 2, I'm just going to pop this in a bag and put it in the fridge to rest, to allow the flour particles to absorb some of the water so that some gluten is allowed to develop. We don't want a lot of gluten, but we want some gluten to develop so that the pastry is easier to roll out because it becomes slightly more elastic, and it will prevent it from shrinking.